This is a very significant event for us. I am Thomas Bellew. I'm the head of public diplomacy here. And with my colleague Elias Ben-Manah, we are delighted to welcome you to this important event for us, where we look back at what was a very important time for Ireland, when we were a fledgling state, when we were finding our feet, and when we were reaching out on the international stage. We have asked Dr. Darragh Gannon of Queen's University Belfast to speak to us today about the significance and importance of this time in Ireland-German relations, and the appointment of Nancy Wyse Power as the first official Irish representative to Germany in Berlin in the 16th of April 1921, just over 100 years ago today. But before we hear from Dr. Darragh Gannon, I'd like to call upon the Ambassador of Ireland to Germany, Dr. Nicholas O'Brien, to say a few words, and again to welcome you all. And please, Ambassador, if you'd like to.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Thomas. And good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gannon, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the event this afternoon. And we're going to celebrate, and in fact, we had hoped to do this in person in Berlin, but these are the times we're living in. We're going to celebrate the first Irish official appointed to Germany by the very first Irish Parliament, or Dáil Éireann as it's called, of the then self-declared Irish Republic in 1921. So less than 5 short years after the tumultuous events of 1916, when Ireland and its peoples rose up to declare itself as an independent nation and sought to take its place on the world stage, Ireland in 1921 was trying to make good on that promise. Now, doing this at a particular point in world history, it was a fairly daunting time. It was coming soon after the end of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles had come into force. And Ireland in 1921 was a severely, chronically poor economy. It had very limited financial resources. And like anyone else and any of the fledgling member states then, these early days were very precarious, both politically and economically. But nevertheless, a conscious and a very deliberate decision was taken by the government of the first Dáil, or Parliament, under the leadership of Eamon de Valera, to appoint envoys to strategic locations around the globe. And their job was to speak on behalf of Ireland and to bring to the attention of overseas nations Ireland's ambition to become a sovereign, independent nation. There was a real level of ambition about the first offices, and they were established not only in Berlin, but in Washington, Paris, Rome, Russia, Antwerp, Argentina, Chile, Spain. And of course, it was deemed imperative to have an office in the then Weimar Republic. And 2 of these offices were led by women, and this is where the story of Nancy Wyse Power as Ireland's first official appointee to Germany begins. Now, Nancy Wyse Power's story in Germany, and indeed Ireland-German relations at that time, deserved serious treatment. And it's great to have someone of the calibre of Dr. Darragh Gannon here with us this afternoon to talk about these events and these times. Darragh is a research fellow at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University Belfast, and he's also the Vice President of the Global Irish Diaspora Congress. He has previously lectured at Maynooth University and University College Dublin, and served as curatorial researcher to the National Museum of Ireland's Centenary exhibition entitled Proclaiming a Republic, the 1916 Rising. He has published widely on global Irish diaspora and the Irish Revolution, and he is currently completing a monograph entitled Worlds of Revolution, Ireland's Global Moment 1919 to 1923, as part of the AHRC-funded A Global History of Irish Revolution, which is a project between Queen's University Belfast and the University of Edinburgh. Excuse me. And this will be based on original archival research in 10 countries: Australia, Argentina, Canada, France, India, Italy, Japan, South Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And this study will examine the historical contribution of the global Irish diaspora to the formation of independent Ireland. His lecture today is entitled Gallant Allies in Europe, A Century of Ireland-German Relations. And this will examine Irish-German relations in the modern era, from the fledgling days of the modern Irish state. Although the first formal Irish legation in Berlin would not be opened until 1929 by Professor Daniel Binchi, who was Ireland's first, what we call in diplomatic terms, envoy extraordinaire and minister plenipotentiary to Germany. Today, we celebrate and bear witness to the work of Nancy Wyse Power, some 8 years earlier, in spreading the news of Ireland in a very cosmopolitan, multicultural, and indeed receptive Berlin. I'm conscious that I address you today as the 22nd Ambassador of Ireland to Germany, and that a large portion of the goodwill, the friendship which I enjoy in this position is due to the hard work over many years by my predecessors. And although the way, I suppose, the manner in which we interact and engage with our German interlocutors today necessarily changes over time, I'm convinced that we collectively owe a debt to the pioneering work of Nancy Wyse Power 100 years ago in 1921 in Berlin. So I very much look forward to listening to your lecture today, Dr. Gannon, and to learning much of the extent of Nancy Wyse Power's work and the depth of gratitude that we rightfully owe her. So Darragh, you're very welcome and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Ambassador O'Brien. It's honor agus is privilege vor damsa ve gober le ambassador na Heran in Merlin, con an lake tavak de shop, a horch agus con an nask idir era agus on Garmon and Yartu. Ik möchte bei unseren vielen Freunden und Kollegen bedanken, die heute in Deutschland zuhören. Ich hoffe, nach dem Vortrag die Gelegenheit zu haben, etwas über eure Bereiche von irischem Interesse von Berlin bis München zu erfahren. I would like to thank the Embassy of Ireland for the opportunity to speak to you today on German-Irish time. I am grateful to Thomas Bellew and Elias Ben-Mana for coordinating this truly transnational event, and above all to His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Nicholas O'Brien for his kind invitation and indeed generous introduction. Ambassador O'Brien, among his many accolades, is an alumnus of Queen's University, Belfast, holding a doctorate in governance from Queen's. And I'm sure, Ambassador O'Brien, that I speak for our Chancellor, Dr. Hillary Clinton, and by many colleagues across the university in saying that we very much look forward to welcome you back to Belfast in the not too distant future. Elias, if we could have the first slide, please. So in 2017, I embarked on an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project between Queen's University Belfast and the University of Edinburgh, which sought to examine the historic contributions of the global Irish diaspora to the making of independent Ireland. This research has taken me physically and digitally to archives in over 10 countries. In speaking to you this afternoon, I aim to present to you both the historical answers and commemorative questions gathered in my journey of 1,080 days around the world, if you will. Mapping the contours of the global Irish world a century ago requires attention to contemporary alignments of nationalist politics and place. The idea of Irish sovereignty this research presents was conceptualized, idealized, and indeed emphasized in different global spaces and different world times, with the view to framing recognition of Irish independence in terms of what Sebastian Conrad and Dominic Saxonmeyer have termed global moments. Berlin, as much as Dublin, was of capital importance in securing international recognition of the Irish Republic. On the 16th of April 1921, Nancy Wyse Power arrived in Berlin as the first Dáil diplomat posted to Germany. Establishing an Irish propaganda office, Wyse Power circulated the Dáil's address to the representatives of foreign nations to members of the Reichstag, and worked alongside German scholars to produce a weekly Irish Bulletin containing news of the Irish War of Independence. The Bulletin would become essential reading for prominent figures such as the former Secretary of State for the German Naval Office, Admiral von Tirpitz. In the aftermath of the First World War, Wyse Power worked in a very multicultural Berlin, collaborating with Turkish, Indian, and Egyptian nationalists in the German capital. She developed significant international relations for the cause of the Irish Republic. Drawing on new archival sources in Ireland, Germany, India, the United Kingdom, and the United States, This lecture will explore the history of German-Irish international relations 100 years ago through the revolutionary journey of Nancy Wyse Power. Next slide, please, Ilias. As Michael Kennedy's illuminating entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography attests, the revolutionary life of Nancy Wyse Power was not born, it was made. Born in Dublin on the 16th of November 1889, Nancy was raised in an advanced nationalist home. Her father, John Wyse Power, a civil servant and journalist, was a member of the IRB and a founding member of the GAA. Her mother, Jenny Wyse Power, was a successful businesswoman and political activist who, having become involved in the Ladies' Land League alongside Anna Parnell, became the vice president of Sinn Féin in 1912 and the president of Cumann na mBan in 1914. The family-run Irish Farm Produce Company on Henry Street in Dublin would become a key site of nationalist meetings in the years before the Rising, such that the 1916 proclamation was signed by Pearse, Connolly, Clark et al. At their home. The nationalist influence of the Wyse Powers, or rather the Wyse Nolans, would of course be immortalised in James Joyce's Ulysses, with John Wyse crediting Leopold Bloom for influencing Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin ideas. Quote, all kinds of gerrymandering, packed juries, and swindling the taxes off the government, and appointing consuls all over the world to talk about selling Irish industries, unquote. The young Nancy Wyse Power, meanwhile, had graduated with a first-class honours in BA in Celtic Studies at University College Dublin, and indeed had begun a PhD at the University of Bonn when the First World War and Rising intervened. Serving as a courier in the week before the rebellion, Nancy served in the GPO during Easter week itself. In its aftermath, she became a leading figure in the Irish National Aid Association and Volunteer Dependence Fund and Cumann na mBan. Considered a protege of Countess Markievicz, she was heavily involved in campaigning for Sinn Féin at the 19 general election, particularly following the arrest of Markievicz and other Sinn Féin leaders under the idea of the German plot. Weeks later, on the 21st of January 1919, 27 members of Sinn Féin took their seats at the Mansion House in Dublin. Their assembly in the capital was to fulfil the electoral promise of Sinn Féin and the ideological promise of Irish nationalism, the establishment of an independent parliament. Standing before an audience of 1,000, the Sinn Féin MPs now presented themselves as Teach the Dála, or deputies of the Dáil. Proceeding as Gaeilge, acting Príomh-Mhara Cathal Brugha proclaimed the legislative powers of the revolutionary government comprising ministries of finance, foreign affairs, home affairs and defence. A declaration of independence, message to the free nations of the world and democratic programme were proclaimed, while Eamon de Valera and Arthur Griffith, both still in prison, were delegated in absentia to address the Paris Peace Conference. In conclusion, the first Dáil constituted the first elected government of the Irish Republic. Writing before the first meeting of the first Dáil, Arthur Griffith had famously observed that the Irish nation existed behind a British paper wall. Quote, on the inside, she told Ireland what she wanted the Irish to believe about the world, and on the outside, she told the world what she wanted them to believe about Ireland, unquote. Irish nationalists, led by Griffith, nonetheless, struggled to break through the paper wall and educate international audiences on the political development of the Irish Republic. Dáil Éireann was proclaimed illegal in September of 1919, while Republican journals such as Nationality and New Ireland were suppressed by the Dublin Castle administration. The establishment of the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Propaganda in April 1919, respectively, were intended as a counterweight to the British press. Sean T. O'Kelly and George Gavin Duffy, the Dáil's premier diplomats, exchanged positions between Paris and Rome recurrently throughout the period. Michael McWhite, who had also served as part of the Paris mission in 1919, was later transferred to Geneva. Art O'Brien and Count Gerald O'Kelly set up consular offices in London and Antwerp, respectively, while Moran O'Brien, who Ambassador O'Brien has referenced, assumed a publicity portfolio in Madrid. Dáil Éireann was also nominally represented in Scandinavia by Sean Dunn and Gerard O'Loughlin, who established press agencies in Norway and Denmark successively. Most ambitiously, perhaps, Patrick McCartan travelled to Moscow from New York in 1920 with the view to establishing diplomatic relations between the Irish Republic and Bolshevik Russia. Letters informing Dáil Éireann of developments on the continent were nominally sent to the Dáil Secretary, Diarmaid O'Hegarty, its Directors of Publicity, Desmond Fitzgerald and Erskine Childers, and its Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs from 1921, Robert Brennan. And it's here that Nancy Wyse Power enters stage left. Quote, in late March or early April, Bob Brennan came to me and said he had taken over the External Affairs Department. The Dáil cabinet were now anxious to set up an office in Berlin to issue a bulletin and start publicity. The instructions he gave me were to go first to Paris, and there I would meet Mr. John Charteris, who, it was desired, should act as envoy in Berlin. If he was agreeable to go direct to Berlin, I could turn back to Dublin. But if he decided otherwise, I would go to Berlin and start the bulletin. He said, first of all, he would have to get more definite instructions. And secondly, Charteris said he would have to resign formally from the British Civil Service. I quite understood that he could not take up the appointment in Berlin in mid-channel, so I went on to Berlin and he came to Dublin. I got to Berlin with nothing but instructions to start a bulletin and a list of people who might be interested or useful. Unquote. So I'd like to invite you to journey with me over the next 30 minutes or so as we follow Nancy Wyse Power on her daily travels across the German capital. Nancy Wyse Power, the first Bridget meets Berlin, if you will. Arriving in Berlin in April of 1921, Nancy established the office of the German Irish Bulletin on Nassauische Straße in Wilmersdorf. The Irish Bulletin was originally a mimeographed news sheet published by the Dáil Department of Publicity in Dublin from November 1919, and perhaps the most celebrated example of Republican propaganda. In spite of the British authorities' attempts to suppress the journal, the Bulletin was successfully published 5 times weekly without missing a single issue. Opening with a small circulation of approximately 50 readers, subscriptions to the Irish Bulletin grew exponentially as the War of Independence intensified. By October 1920, the Bulletin in Dublin had attracted 600 subscribers. The idea of developing an Irische Bulletin, however, was very much born in Berlin. Visiting Germany in February 1921 on the direction of Eamon de Valera, George Gavin Duffy reported, quote, I am convinced that it is most necessary to have a political and commercial representative as soon as possible in Berlin, and a press bureau is badly needed, for hardly any Irish news gets through, unquote. Gavin Duffy's urgency had in fact been informed by a meeting with Gustav Stresemann, chairman of the German People's Party and of course future Chancellor and Foreign Minister of the Weimar Republic. Quote, Gustav stated that very little was known here about Serstott Éireann, and that it would be extremely useful to send to the principal politicians a monthly bulletin in their own language, unquote. And while earlier proposals had been received from Irish nationalists in Germany, it was Duffy's meeting with Stresemann which spurred the Dáil cabinet into action. Writing from Berlin in the spring of 1921, Nancy Wyse Power was initially optimistic at the potential success for Irish propaganda in Germany. Quote, the press generally, but more especially the conservative press, seems favourable. It publishes all available Irish news in a prominent position, but up to the present, the value of such a publication has been somewhat diminished by the fact that the German papers were dependent mainly on the Press Association and that the news had consequently the wrong tinge. And this was notable in the description of the events of the 21st of November, referring to Bloody Sunday, and again at the time of the burning of Cork in December of 1920. She goes on to say, a good supply of properly coloured news is essential, unquote. However, under the pressures of the ongoing War of Independence in Ireland, the Dáil found it difficult to send the bulletin to Berlin for translation. Increasingly isolated, Wyse Power wrote to her mother on the 22nd of April from her room at the Hardenberg Hotel on Joachimsthaler Straße, quote, Will you tell our friends that I await instruction most impatiently, as it is very difficult to keep in with all here while the thing is uncertain, unquote. 3 weeks later, she was more optimistic. Quote, I set about work arranged with the university professor to undertake the actual wording of the bulletin and issue an explanatory letter to newspaper editors, unquote. The professor to whom she referred was Julius Pokorny, the Austrian-Czech linguist and renowned scholar of the Celtic languages, who had succeeded Kuno Meyer as chair of Celtic philology at Friedrich Wilhelm University, the modern-day Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. During the First World War, Pokorny was involved in Irish propagandist activities in Germany, corresponding with Roger Casement in advance of the Easter Rising. In 1921, Nancy would journey to the Mitte district daily to work with Professor Pokorny in the creation of the Irish Bulletin, wherein she also continued her PhD in Celtic Studies under her supervision. And I think it's important to say, especially if any Queen's students are listening in, we don't recommend that you pursue a revolutionary career alongside your studies, but obviously an exception can be made for the Honourable Nancy Wyse Power. Indeed, her work as a revolutionary often conflicted with her part-time studies. Writing to Dáil Éireann, she advised that she must respect her university commitments, advising that she had committed to correcting matriculation papers at the end of June. Quote, I do not wish to lose my superintending work, unquote. We can get the next slide, please, Ilias. Despite that delicate balancing act between academic and revolutionary, Wyse Power was nonetheless a skilled propagandist with a keen awareness of the sensitivities and nuances underpinning her role. Arranging meetings with the editors of Berlin's dailies, she observed, quote, I do not wish it to be understood that there is anything like pro-English feeling in Germany. If there is, I never met it. But it appeared to me that English propaganda was working very unobtrusively to bring about such feeling gradually, and that it would be well to counter it early. There is a slight tendency noticeable in the Rhineland to contrast the conduct of the English troops favourably with that of the French and American armies. In this point, I would respectively suggest that anti-English, as distinct from pro-Irish propaganda, would be of value, unquote. And Nancy Wyse Power would increasingly ask for propaganda from Dublin in the form of contemporary photographs as a means to convince the ordinary Germans of the innate vices of British rule in Ireland. However, again, this was not necessarily forthcoming from Dublin, and Nancy Wyse Power and Julius Pokorny often had to rely on information gleaned from British newspapers available in Berlin. And this led ultimately to the publication, the first 2 issues of Irish Bulletin by the end of May of 1921. Now, the topics of Irish Bulletin were quite wide-ranging. Not only did they document the ongoing War of Independence in Ireland, but it also spoke to the constructive work of Dáil Éireann, including the Department of Foreign Affairs, biographies of leading Sinn Féiners, and more specifically, the issue of partition was front and central in many of the issues of Irish Bulletin, especially from the summer of 1921. And you can see that in the presentation in front of you. In fact, Nancy Wyse Power, on reflection of this period in her life, would say of German news correspondents and editors, quote, they all put the same question to me, what about Ulster, unquote. News of Wyse Power's actions and the impact of the Berlin Bulletin, in fact, reached the desk of Karl von Schubert, the head of the British-American Department of the German Foreign Office, in the autumn of 1921. Quote, recent information has reached me from several sources showing that certain inquiries have been conducted and certain observations made, which indicate that the impression exists in official circles that the printing in the German language of a bulletin consisting of translations of news items from English papers, which items deal particularly with Irish news, in some way evidences cooperation between Germany and the people of Ireland, cooperation which may be injurious to the interests of Germany, unquote. And the German Foreign Office and von Schubert in particular would keep a very close watch over Wyse Power's actions during her time in Berlin. At the end of her reign in Berlin, her time in Berlin at the end of 1922, however, over 150 issues of the Irish Bulletin had been published. Addressing Dáil Éireann in August 1921, Assistant Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs Robert Brennan declared, quote, "A press bureau has been established in Berlin, where the initial work regarding the issuing of a bulletin has been carried out by a talented young Dublin lady. A number of our friends in Berlin are also rendering assistance in the publication of the bulletin, which, we have been informed, has met with an encouraging reception," unquote. A commemorative question to follow. How can the language of commemoration similarly open the centenary of Irish independence to foreign interest and interpretation? There are many who will revisit the history of the Irish War of Independence between Dublin and London. Lasst sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. Next slide, please, Elias. The post-war Weimar Republic was born into revolution. The declaration of the German Republic by Philipp Scheidemann outside the Reichstag on 9th November 1918 was followed by the Spartacist uprising weeks later, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Friedrich Ebert's government's deploying of the right-wing Freikorps to suppress the Bolshevik-inspired revolt denoted the political instability and political violence which would ultimately define the life of Weimar Germany. And of course, this has been expertly detailed by, among others, Mark Jones. Observing the political upheaval in post-war Berlin, Wyse Power would reflect, quote, "There were all kinds of underground movements in Germany at the time. To add to every other trouble, the place was full of British spies and German spies. You did not know who was a spy. The whole thing was like a detective story," unquote. Nancy Wyse Power was very much part of that British Berlin underworld. Through contacts in the university circuit, she was introduced at a dinner party to Admiral von Tirpitz, former Secretary of State of the German Imperial Naval Office during the First World War, who, he said, was keen to receive copies of the Irish Bulletin. Nancy Wyse Power would later comment, quote, "He was very interested in the Irish question from the point of view of the lessons in organised resistance to an occupying force to be derived from a study of Irish methods. He was most anxious that we get someone to come over and just give talks to these underground bodies. I explained to him the difficulties, such as that few of our active men in the IRA knew German, and that even one could not be spared. He said if anyone could just come along and say he knew the Lord Mayor of Cork, who had recently died, Terence McSweeney, it would make an immense impression," unquote. Von Tirpitz's discussion with Wyse Power is illustrative, I would argue, of what Wolfgang Schimmelbusch has described as the culture of defeat in interwar Germany. Quote, "The idea that victory achieved by unsoldierly means is illegitimate," unquote. While in Berlin, meanwhile, George Gavin Duffy had been introduced to Count Ernst Graf zu Reventlow, who, quote, "would be very glad to have further information and to be in closer touch," unquote. Reventlow, the editor of the Deutsche Tageszeitung and the former lieutenant commander in the German Imperial Navy, had published a treatise against the British Empire, the English translation of which is The Vampire of the Continent, during the First World War. And he too would be very critical of the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s, subsequently joining the Nazi Party. In 1920, in fact, he had founded his own newspaper, Der Reichswart, the Reich Guardian, which would reprint articles from the Irish Bulletin alongside more extreme editorials on political life in Weimar, Germany. We can get the next slide, please, Elias. And here you have an extract from Reventlow's Der Reichswart from December of 1920. His earlier publication, The Vampire of the Continent, had in fact been translated into English by George Chatterton Hill, who would later assist Wyse Power in the translation of the Irish Bulletin. The Madras-born, Genevan-educated Irish intellectual was a prolific writer on politics, sociology, and philosophy, publishing works such as Heredity and Selection in Sociology and The Philosophy of Nietzsche, an Exposition and an Appreciation in 1913. Like fellow academic and friend Julius Pokorny, Chatterton Hill was a keen member of the German-Irish Society in Berlin and had in fact corresponded with Roger Casement in advance of the 1916 Rising. 1 year later, he established Irische Blatter, or Irish Leaves, a monthly journal advocating for stronger German-Irish relations. Unquote, quote, "The Irish have acted as friends at home as well as in the United States, and Germany must not underestimate the value of Irish friendship. The German-Irish Society," he continued, "will devote its energies to reopening Ireland to the world, and especially to Germany," unquote. And the Society's connections with the German political and military elite were evident. General Ludendorff communicated his support for the enterprise, while Matthias Erzberger, who would head the German delegation signing the peace armistice with the Allies in November 1918, subsequently becoming Reich Minister of Finance from 1919 to 1920, was in fact elected the Society's first president. Chatterton Hill was acknowledged as a gifted writer, but an unstable and unreliable figure. As Minister for Finance in Dublin, Michael Collins had initially sent him money to support his ongoing propaganda work, but this was discontinued in 1921. Nancy Wyse Power, further, was suspicious that he may have leaked information of her meeting with Count Reventlow in Berlin to British intelligence agents, politely writing to Dublin, quote, "Chatterton Hill may have a certain amount of journalistic ability and experience, but he has not a good grasp of the Irish situation. Although I try to meet him in an unprejudiced spirit, I am quite convinced that he is not the type of man to be put in charge of work of this kind," unquote. In later life, Chatterton Hill again would fall into poor financial and indeed personal health, offering to translate the British news into German for the Nazi regime in Berlin during the Second World War. He would die of destitution on the 12th of January 1947. His story, like that of many Irish nationalists active in interwar Berlin, I would argue, was that of a greater war history. A question for commemoration. Will the politics of commemoration, accordingly, be open to alternative non-Irish historical narratives and interpretive frameworks? There are some who will revisit the Irish War of Independence as an island story. Last see nach Berlin kommen, let them come to Berlin. If we can get the next slide, please, Ilias. Quote, "There appear to be no less than 6 revolutionary committees in Berlin, directing their efforts to the detriment of Great Britain," Home Office Director of Intelligence Basil Thompson communicated to the British Cabinet in 1920. These organisations include the Egyptian Committee, the Germano-Irish Society, the Society of Oppressed Peoples, the Indian Committee, and the Pan-Islamic Committee, unquote. Thompson's report is indicative of the imperial import of Berlin in the aftermath of the First World War. In the official mind, Berlin was an anti-imperial metropolis, to use the term adopted by Michael Goebbels. The collaborative activities of Irish nationalists with other anti-colonial groups in Berlin would work them ultimately into the notebooks of intelligence agencies across the world, from the United States to India. Writing in September 1919, the Director of Central Intelligence in Delhi reported, quote, "A meeting of Indian, Irish, and Egyptian societies at which speakers painted in affecting words the sufferings and burdens of their countries and peoples under the yoke of England," unquote. Germany was naturally, if not truthfully, hailed as the liberator of the oppressed, and the untaught powers, particularly England, were stigmatized as oppressors, the report continued. Pillai was among those who addressed the meeting, unquote. Financed by the German Foreign Office, Indian students and political activists in Berlin had formed the Indian Independence Committee during the war, with the view to coordinating uprisings against British rule in India as part of the international Hindu-German conspiracy. Among those who dominated the post-war Berlin underground was the Kerala-born Chimpakaram Pillai, the alleged mastermind of the German naval attack on Madras Harbour in September 1914. I saw Pillai, who was recognised here during the war as the Indian representative, George Galvin Duffy, reported to Dublin in 1921. A memorandum by Pillai on Ireland is appended, and the impression strongly produced is that Peli is quite genuine, unquote. The Dáil cabinet responded to Gavin Duffy in kind, quote, it would be useful to keep in touch with them, unquote. While Peli's plans for Ireland were not disclosed, Basil Thomson viewed his network in Berlin as part of a broader threat to the British Empire. Quote, Peli is devoting most of his attention at present to persuading the Turkish, Egyptian, and other revolutionary committees to work with the League Against Imperialism, unquote. Indian activists who espoused advanced left-wing political views further worked closely with Irish nationalists in Berlin. Virendranath Chattopadhyay had been a leading figure on the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin during the war, subsequently traveling to Moscow to meet with Lenin. Encountering Chattopadhyay in Berlin, Gavin Duffy described him, quote, as representing everything that is on the left and who loves Bolsheviks, unquote. To Nancy Wyse Power, further, Chattopadhyay was of great support. Wyse Power, indeed, was often invited by Chattopadhyay and his partner, the American journalist and left-wing activist Agnes Smedley, to their home on Georg Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. The strength of their relationship, she later recalled, was mutual respect. Quote, he was a high-caste Indian educated at Oxford. Chatta, as he was called for short, accepted me, unquote. In post-war Berlin, the intimate connections and shared experiences of Irish and Indian revolutionaries were a radical departure from the conservative politics of Dublin. Collaboration with other anti-colonial groups in Berlin, however, did not necessarily equate to a validation of their political ideology. Sugita Bose and Chris Manhapra have termed these intimate but contingent political spaces cosmopolitan thought zones. Quote, cosmopolitan thought zones are the treacherous and provisional shared worlds that arise when disparate groups seek to solve problems together in order to address their pressing concerns, unquote. During his visit to Berlin in February of 1921, George Gavin Duffy had met with Talat Pasha, who had served as Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, before being succeeded by Kemal Ataturk. Talat is very keen on working with Searstott Éireann and Peli and Chattopadhyay in cooperation, Gavin Duffy reported to Dublin. A favourable response from Dublin, however, was not forthcoming. Pasha had gone into hiding in Berlin in 1918 on account of his overseeing of the Armenian genocide 3 years earlier, which saw the deportation and killing of over 1 million ethnic Armenians across the Ottoman Empire. 1 month after meeting Gavin Duffy at his hideout on Hardenbergstrasse, he was assassinated by an Armenian gunman. Gavin Duffy would send his condolences to his successor, Nassim Bey. Observing from a distance, Nancy Wyse Power would comment, quote, Talat Pasha has been the most prominent of the young Turk leaders. After the war, he took refuge in Berlin, living a hidden existence under an alias as he knew that a group of Armenians had sworn to take his life. Immediately after meeting Gavin Duffy, Talat became uneasy and was heard to say that he had been told one should never trust an Irishman. Whether the visit was the cause of his whereabouts being portrayed or not, within a very short time, Talat was shot outside his house, unquote. In the cosmopolitan thought zones of post-war Berlin, Irish nationalists encountered Egyptian, Indian, and Turkish activists with a diverse range of ideological beliefs and backgrounds. A commemorative question. How can cosmopolitan experiences of revolution in the early 20th century inform multicultural commemoration of Irish independence in the 21st? There are a few who will revisit the War of Independence as an Anglo-Irish war. Lasst sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. So, in conclusion, of the last slide, please, Ilias. Reflecting on the Irish Revolution in his acclaimed memoir, Allegiance, former Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, Robert Brennan, observed, quote, everywhere I went on the continent in 1921, I had evidence that we had broken through the paper wall with which England had surrounded us, unquote. Integral to this propaganda breakthrough was Nancy Wyse Power. Arriving in Berlin as the first Dáil diplomat posted to Germany, Wyse Power established an Irish propaganda office, circulated the Dáil's address to the representatives of foreign nations, to members of the Reichstag, and worked alongside German scholars to produce a weekly Irish Bulletin containing news of the Irish War of Independence. In that literary process, she met and worked alongside senior German political and military figures, such as former Secretary of State for the Admiralty, Alfred von Tirpitz, and Count Ernst von Reventlow. In the aftermath of the First World War, Wyse Power worked in a multicultural Berlin. Collaborating with Turkish, Indian, and Egyptian nationalists in the German capital, she developed significant international relations for the cause of the Irish Republic. Importantly, in 1920, and again, this goes back to our students at Queen's, she nonetheless completed her doctorate in Berlin under the professor of Celtic Studies, Julius Pokorny, on the subject of Celtic philology. Writing in her support in May of 1922, 5 months before she would ultimately leave Berlin, acting Irish envoy John Charteris stated, quote, "I recommend that Miss Nancy Wyse Power's salary should be increased from £25 a month to £30 a month. I also recommend that she should be given a bonus for the 12 weeks or more during which she acted with sole responsibility during my absence. She has brought great capacity, judgment, and industry to her work," unquote. The German Foreign Office would comment on German-Irish relations in 1921. Quote, "England is now engaged in a very determined effort to re-establish friendly relations with the people of Ireland, and there can be no doubt that one of the controlling motives is to win back for English business the Irish market. Today, the Irish, realizing this coming development and being imbued with a real friendship for Germany and the German people, intend to the full extent of their ability to purchase in Germany, so far as procurable, the wares and machinery necessary for their business survival and industrial development. Nothing would better suit English businessmen and English diplomacy than to have the German government make some gesture showing an unfriendliness toward Ireland on the part of Germany. In view of all the facts and circumstances outlined, it is evident that an unfriendly gesture towards Ireland on the part of the German government would constitute an act of ingratitude with but few parallels in history," unquote. The study of German-Irish international relations a century ago prompts important commemorative questions. How can the language of commemoration open the centenary of Irish independence to foreign interest and interpretation? Will the politics of commemoration be open to alternative non-Irish historical narratives and interpretive frameworks? And how can cosmopolitan experiences of revolution in the early 20th century inform multicultural commemoration of Irish independence in the 21st? The history of German-Irish relations a century ago imparts a wider and deeper footprint for Irish scholars to follow. Lasst sie nach Berlin kommen, let them come to Berlin. Addressing the Conference on Centres of Irish Studies in Germany last year, Ambassador Nicholas O'Brien called for a series of starting points to the development of Irish studies in Germany, encouraging, quote, "Irish studies thrived in the past. There is still scope for raising the profile even further." A call for papers, if you will, that I'm sure Dr. Nancy Wyse Power would have approved. More indeed could have been said in my lecture on the wide and deep footprint of Irish studies in Germany a century ago, had time and space allowed, from the celebrated Celtic scholarship of Professor Rudolf Durnison at the University of Bonn to the studies of future Irish ambassador to Germany, Daniel Binchy, at the University of Munich. In presenting to you the revolutionary story of Nancy Wyse Power in the German capital this afternoon, however, I hope this lecture has offered one such starting point to the development of Irish studies in Germany. Ich bin Berliner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gannon. That has been very insightful and enlightening. And there's quite a lot of illustrious names you pointed out, and you've given us a very good overview of where Nancy Wyse Power was at, where the Irish Dáil was at, and where Germany was at. And I thank you for your presentation. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people on the floor would like to put some questions to you. And I would ask that if anybody should have or would like to raise a question, that you might switch on your camera and unmute your microphone. Raise your hand digitally in the actual facility on the top right of your screen, or physically wave us to the camera like this. So if I can just check to see if anybody has a question. Would anybody like to put a question to Dr. Gannon? If not, sorry, is somebody coming in there?
Thomas, I might actually come in on this one.
Yes.
You know, I didn't particularly want to dwell on it because, you know, like she was appointed because she was an exceptional person. But the thing that strikes me, the Ireland of the 1920s, and not only Ireland, like the Europe and the world of the 1920s, this is meant in a really very positive sense about her. Like, it must have been unusual appointing a woman to such a senior position, given it was a very kind of, you know, male-dominated society, and you know, just coming out of the war, still a very kind of, you know, kind of macho, male-dominated society in Germany, I would have thought.
Very much so. That's a really important point to make. I think that, again, perhaps in the 21st century, we take this idea for granted, you know, that of you know, female representatives of the Irish state, and, you know, that visibility which we kind of see today. But of course, 100 years ago, that wasn't the fact. And we often talk in Irish historical terms about Countess Markievicz being the first MP or TD elected in 1918. But if we look internationally at the fledgling Irish foreign affairs, we see people like Nancy Wyse Power in Berlin, Maureen O'Brien in Madrid, Annie Vivanti, who was the wife of John Chartres, who was very active in Paris. And so there are a number of figures who are really influential that made a deep impact on the propaganda war, so to speak. And if we think about the War of Independence internationally, there's a propaganda war running parallel to the kind of the actual fighting in Ireland itself, which I would wager and argue is as significant in terms of securing international recognition. And I think one of the interesting things about Nancy Wyse Power in that respect is that she was, of course, stationed in Berlin on the basis that John Chartres was not available to visit as envoy originally in 1921, but she really made that position her own. She developed those connections with German academics, with senior German military and political figures. As I tried to outline in the lecture, she was very much a visible representative in various spaces around Berlin. And I think as well, she was quite cosmopolitan, and that's something which is not necessarily the case for everyone who was involved in the Irish revolutionary movement. Roy Foster, in his brilliant book Vivid Faces, has talked about this idea of a pre-revolutionary generation, which was intellectually minded, culturally engaged, literate in a political sense, widely read and so on. And that in the War of Independence period, we have IRA guerrillas, for example, who are not necessarily of that kind of middle class standing, whereas Nancy Wyse Power, through her parents, through her education, and I think in Germany through her expertise in the German language, was very much accepted by her contemporaries. And I think it's quite telling that Virendranath Chattobaya, the Indian communist revolutionary, accepted her on those terms. So I think Nancy Wyse Power, because of her cosmopolitan credentials, could speak the language of revolution, which perhaps Irish revolutionaries on the island could not. And I think she's, you know, a fascinating figure in her own right, and someone who I think is deserving of a biography. You know, if there are any takers for that going forward.
Ambassador, yeah. Did you want to come back in again on that, Ambassador, or are we okay?
No, thanks. Thanks very much, Darragh.
Have we got any other questions, or has everybody? Oh,
sure,
Patricia,
yeah.
please.
Yes, I realised I put my hand up at precisely the moment when Dr. Gannon said, is anybody volunteering to write the biography? I'm not volunteering, but thank you very much for a very interesting talk and you know, in a very stimulating, pivotal moment in modern history. The question that I have is, what you've sketched out is the way that Nancy Wyse Power engaged with the revolutionary moment globally. Things I was curious about was whether you've come across any connections, I'm afraid this is a fairly specific question, to Irish connections to the German Liberal Party in sort of broad terms, because that's a kind of critical group, critical of British imperialism in Ireland. Somebody I've done some work on, Julius Moritz-Horn, is somebody that is married to an Irish woman and writes about the problems of the famine and criticises British colonial behaviour, but is also a sort of central politician in Germany. And so I wondered about the kind of less radical aspects of the Irish perspective on German politics, on whether, you know, whether it's all about revolutionary fervent and whether they think the Weimar Republic is going south from the very beginning, whether Nancy Wyse Power thinks that, or whether they're also trying to shore up a political centre in Germany in the face of you know, extremism from the left and the right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting question, and I'm mindful of your own work in transnational history as one of the foremost scholars in that period. And when I was thinking about preparing today's lecture, I was thinking about your idea of centering transnational history through the individual, through the, you know, the biographical. So I think Nancy Wyse Power is very interesting in that respect, because she has, in various sites across Berlin, she is developing networks with German activists of both extremes, really. But I think there is a space in the centre, and she does report in her retrospective witness statement that she had sent a copy of the Dáil address to foreign nations, to every member of the Reichstag, but only one member of the Communist Party, I think, had in fact replied. So I think there was that sense of trying to appeal to the centre. And I would suspect, hopefully through further research of the German press, for example, that I would be able to discern her influence in terms of communicating ideas about Ireland in some of the Berlin dailies in that respect. I've been very fortunate to have had access to the German Foreign Office files, which I've alluded to in the presentation. And of course, the nature of state surveillance is that they document the kind of revolutionary or kind of, you know, non-legitimate aspects of someone like Nancy Wyse Power's work. But I do feel that there's an opportunity, as you suggest, to explore other strands of political connection. And I think especially perhaps going into 1922, when the Irish Free State is established and so on, that, you know, this idea of becoming part of, and this term is actually used by nationalists at the time in Ireland, the European Comity, to become seen almost as European as much as Irish, and in a way speaking to the respectability of Irish nationalist politics with the view to admission to the League of Nations and so on in 1922. And in other respects, I've come across documentation which says that Indian and Egyptian activists were very disappointed by the signing of the treaty, for example, which was seen as a great betrayal of this more cosmopolitan post-war global moment. So I think potentially in 1922, we might see greater those connections to kind of liberal centrist politics gain greater salience in the sources.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any further hands up. We're very conscious that you're very learned, and it's 100 years ago since all of this happened. I would have a question, Darragh, in relation to Nancy Wyse Power's appointment. Would you feel that, you said she was there for a short time, would you say that the recommendation that she gets the bonus and that she gets the extra pay was a full validation of her appointment. And what came of her then after that?
So it's a good question, because I think there's an interesting aspect of this in terms of money and so on, that in many ways, if you think about it logically, Nancy Wyse Power gave up, as I alluded to, her studies in terms of pursuing a PhD initially to, to serve as an activist on behalf of the Irish Republic. And, I've seen some letters from her, for example, in which she talks about, that she would send back receipts for her travel, that she wasn't motivated by a salary in that sense. So in a way, she's kind of she's a proto diplomat in that sense. She's not a career diplomat. I don't think she was thinking necessarily in terms of a career in the Irish Foreign Service as it would become. And again, she's balancing a wide range of kind of personal interests, the family business on Henry Street in Dublin. She was active in Common Man, and I haven't seen any kind of suggestions that she inquired about salary or anything. It was more that she was interested in getting copies of the Irish Bulletin from Dublin that motivated many of her letters and so on. And I think that speaks to many of her contemporaries as the early or fledgling Irish state, that they were kind of they were revolutionaries. They weren't quite kind of professional diplomats in that sense. They were finding their feet. They were kind of searching out their role in not only in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of society. So I think she learned quite a lot about how foreign policy works through this experience. And those lessons, hopefully, I think were invaluable to, the first generation of official diplomats under the Irish Free State. She, in terms of her later career, she followed John Charteris into the Irish Civil Service in 1922, following her return, or following her recommendation of her return in late 1922 by George Gavin Duffy, who I referenced during the lecture. And that was because of difficulties with Charles Bewley, the Irish representative in Berlin at the time, and differences of political opinion and personal opinion. But Nancy Wyse Power's status was upheld throughout. She, her mother joined the Irish Senate in the early Irish Free State. Nancy Wyse Power took on a number of roles in Irish society thereafter, in addition to her professional career in terms of women's suffrage, in issues of education. And if you read through the Irish press, which was De Valera and Fianna Fáil's newspaper of record for much of the 20th century, there are a number of articles which, even in the 60s after her death, extol the virtues of Nancy Wyse Power and her activities in Germany. And she's always presented her frame as this kind of academic revolutionary. Again, a double life, which I don't encourage of our students, but nonetheless, I think it's an interesting kind of way of framing her career.
Thank you. I think thank you. I don't think there's any fear of any of your students running off just quite yet. Jerry Malumbi, if you'd like to unmute and if you'd like to ask a question, please, or raise a point.
Okay, where are we? Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me?
That's fine. Hi,
yeah,
Jerry.
Sorry. I'm okay. No, Nancy and John Wyse Power. I made some reference to Joyce's poem "Gas from a Burner," where he talks about John Wyse Power. Are they the Powers whiskey family? No,
I don't think there is a connection. I haven't come across that connection. Their claim to fame in terms of Irish kind of enterprise and business was the Farm Produce Company on Henry Street, which became, as I said, the referred to in Ulysses and it was a kind of a cultural reference point at the time for many revolutionaries, and was a thriving business at the time. You see it in advertisements in all the Irish nationalist journals, So I think that was their primary business, in addition to their own individual roles as journalists and so on.
Yeah, I came across the John Wyse Power in the poem "Gas from a Burner," which we use on Bloomsday, and it's a lovely poem. And and as you said, you made the connection between her and her dad. Just, I mean, something about her dad. I mean, you said he was a friend of Joyce's. And he was involved with the GEA. You said, how influential was he? Is that your field, Darragh?
So it's not really my field, but I mean, if you look at the kind of contemporary record in terms of the literary references, obviously Joyce's Ulysses and so on, he was considered someone of importance at the time. He was a founding member of the Gaelic Athletic Association, and you know that came out of his IRB connections. And you know the very fact as well that the 1916 proclamation was signed in the house and the office space on Henry Street of the Wyse Powers, I think speaks to the sincerity with which they were treated, the trust with which they were treated. You know, so they were an upwardly mobile family, and even without the revolutionary career of Nancy, which we've outlined today, I think they would have been successful in, you know, independent Ireland, notwithstanding those kind of revolutionary credentials. And it's really remarkable how, you know, all of the family essentially became so prolific and gained profiles in terms of Irish nationalism in different respects, from Nancy's mother's connections to Anna Parnell, to her own connections to De Valera and Co in 1921. So there's different generations there. And actually going forward, it could be a way of maybe writing that kind of elusive biography of Nancy Wyse Power in terms of a family portrait, you know, a multi-generational biography. And again, that speaks to, in a very powerful but specific way, Roy Foster's argument about generations and the emergence of revolutionary Ireland in terms of generations. So I think that's a very interesting case study in that.
Thanks, Darragh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Jerry. Have we got any more questions from anybody on the floor? If you'd like to raise your hand or switch on your... If not, then yes, Elias, if you'd like to ask a question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, and thank you very much to you, Darragh. And I really enjoyed your talk, and I think you've really made history come to life in this talk, and give us an idea of how challenging of a task it was for Nancy Wyse Power to set up this office and conduct her work in a time of upheaval in Berlin, and also in terms of how all these intricacies and complexities of international politics were really aggregating in Berlin at the time, especially with all the espionage going on. So I really enjoyed that part. And I have a question which is sort of related to that. It's a straightforward question, and I would like to know how did the British Foreign Service in Berlin respond to the Irish Bulletin and to the activities of the Irish Propaganda Office? And did you find any evidence that Nancy Wyse Power's activities may have soured UK-German relations at that time? So, thank you.
Thank you again for that excellent question, Elias. So yeah, I think that's one of the ways in which, and this is the kind of critique that's often been labeled, let's say, transnational history. For instance, you know, what is the significance of those kind of connections? How can we measure or, you know, give weight to these connections? What ultimately were their political effects? And I can think if you look through the German Foreign Office files, which I've been fortunate to do, you can see, you know, very much that the Irish Bulletin and Nancy Wyse Power's presence in Berlin is certainly having an effect in terms of the British Foreign Services or Foreign Office's representation in Berlin at the time. They were very concerned that there was the potential for the bulletin to be conflated as a German propaganda effort because it was published in German, and I guess it's a testament to her professionalism and how polished it was that it came across as an official, you know, publication, almost as if it had been issued by the German Foreign Office. And so you see a number of kind of communications from the representatives of the British Foreign Office in Berlin to the German Foreign Service, kind of inquiring about Nancy Wyse Berlin, you know, asking for steps to be taken. There are suggestions in the files for steps to be taken to declare the Irish Bulletin illegal, as it had been in Ireland itself during that period, and to shut down her operation, which again was her and a typist in 1921 in an office alongside Professor Pokorny. But this suggests again in the official record, in the official mind at least, that this propaganda effort had undermined the British presence in Berlin. And there was the sense as well that, again, this idea of your enemy's enemy is your friend, that after the First World War, that tensions between Germany and Britain because of the Versailles Treaty and reparations and such were such that Germany might be inclined, for example, to recognize the Irish Republic. And that term republic is also very important in the sense that, the emergence of the Weimar Republic, this idea of republic becomes legitimate in Central and indeed Western Europe. And the Irish Republic, in that sense, speaks to the political lingua franca of the time. And so there were tensions there, certainly into 1921, to the extent that, British representatives asked for her to be removed. And there was certainly, even during the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which some of the documents refer to, that they were still concerned that the propaganda effort was undermining even the peace. So I think that's an interesting angle of inquiry. And I think that it's one of the ways in which we can substantiate the transnational significance of Nancy Wyse Power, but the Irish Revolution more broadly, by looking at those official records and contextualizing, as I've tried to do with other sources, where the Irish Revolution, where the Irish Republic was in the minds, the minutes, and the pages of the written word of contemporaries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Darragh. I take it now at this stage, we are over an hour into our event and this centenary lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Darragh Gannon. If there are no more questions, I would move that we would finish for the afternoon. And thank you for your very, Elias, you want to come in, sorry?
Yeah, if that is okay, because I've taken some notes while Dr. Darragh Gannon was presenting, and I was very much intrigued by the questions he raised in terms of what kind of memory politics can be pursued nowadays, and how we can discuss these. And I've taken some notes, and I may have come up with a few bullet points that might help you answer these questions. So if it's okay with you, I will share them with you now.
Thank you.
And yeah, the question that I found particularly interesting was the one relating to how can cosmopolitan experiences of revolution in the 1920s influence multicultural commemorations in the 21st century. And I was thinking that the example of Nancy Wyse Power and her activities in Berlin can be seen as one of the early examples of exercising soft power in the pursuit of anti-colonial struggles. And this was a huge topic throughout the 20th century for many countries that were fighting for their independence, or for many independence and liberation movements throughout the 20th century. And I believe this has also repercussions nowadays, because it does show how winning popular support, even in places that are perceived to be far away or only tangential to the own liberation struggle, is still of critical importance. So you can see the transnational and the global angle in Nancy Wyse Power's work, and her being cognizant of that, I believe, is really speaks to the pioneering spirit of her work. Another important aspect, I would say, or I would argue, is the idea of bypassing the monopolies on communication at that time, which used to be especially government heavy, and you had newspapers that were printed by large publishing houses or official government communication channels that sort of constructed reality for an entire population. However, what we see with Nancy Wyse Power is also the idea of creating sort of a counter-public. And this is something that nowadays is very, very or highly relevant in so many different ways. I can probably not even summarize that. And for me, as someone who has a background in cultural studies, I would also say that there's an intersectional angle to Nancy Wyse Power's work in terms of how liberation movements also have a gendered element. So her being a female in a male-dominated field, I believe, is also testament to the idea that the expansion of liberty and independence and autonomy is also one that does not just take place on the national level, but is also one thing that relates to issues of gender, class, race, and I think this is so Nancy Wyse Power's example is offers very fertile ground to discuss these questions. So thank you.
Those are really interesting contributions and, very stimulating, Elias, thank you. I think you're absolutely correct about those dimensions. And I think your point about intersectionality is very pertinent as well. And one of the things I was thinking about reading those reports from intelligence agencies in India, in America, in Germany, and the United Kingdom, and, the kind of commentaries which intelligence agencies would kind of proffer onto those groups, Egyptians, Indians, and so on, is this idea of, can the subaltern speak? Very kind of intrinsic, this idea of kind of cultural studies. And I think, in a way, those kind of documents, the official records which we see, give a glimpse of the kind of the agency of those kind of groups, which doesn't necessarily transmit on the page, in the sense of they're all very often nameless representatives, the Egyptians, the Indians, the Persians, and so on and so forth. And I think Nancy Wyse Power's personal testimony, her letters, her retrospective memoir, and so on, allows the subaltern to speak, because she talks about those individuals. She gives voice to Chatubaya, to Talat Pasha, and so on. And I think that's one of the ways we need to think about commemoration, not only in Ireland, but more broadly. What sources and what interpretations can help us give voice to those who contemporaneously, as historically, were in some ways disenfranchised, marginalized by the weight of history. And so I think your points in those regards are very pertinent, especially today in the 21st century. And one of the things as part of the Global Irish Revolution project, which I've tried to do, is to engage in dialogue with scholars from around the world who have different perspectives, on this revolutionary or global moment, as Conrad and Sachsenmeier term it. And I think the kind of East meets West in a very symbolic, but also very geographical way in Berlin. So when I kind of used the kind of JFK refrain, let them come to Berlin, I was trying to suggest in a way that this is a call to historians to use Berlin maybe as in terms of the micro history of how we can practice global history more broadly, by engaging each other in dialogue, exchanging sources, and thinking afresh about how narratives are defined by our cultural knowledge, our geographical perspectives, and so on. So I think Berlin, perhaps uniquely in Europe, is at the core, ultimately, of what transnational history can be. And I think Nancy Wyse Power's her work, but more importantly, her words speak to the significance of transnational history and giving voice to the subaltern.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for that, Elias and Dr. Darragh. That's what happens when we have two academics in the room talking to each other on history. Thank you for more enlightenment. If we don't have any further questions, I see people are leaving now, so it's time perhaps for us to call a close to proceedings. And I again would like to just ask Dr. O'Brien, Ambassador O'Brien, if you'd just like to say farewell or final words, and we can close for the evening.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. And Darragh, thanks very much indeed. In a sense, it's kind of a fabulous tour de raison in terms of what Nancy Wyse Power brought and like the contribution she made. And I greatly look forward, I suppose, in a sense, continuing this discussion, because in terms of kind of I suppose the greats of Irish diplomacy in Germany. She's up there because she was very much kind of leading the field. So thank you very much indeed, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Bye-bye.